The war had already dragged on for far too long, and the allied forces of the civilized races were bleeding out across the stars. Entire fleets had been shattered on the edge of enemy space, and countless worlds had fallen into ruin. The Great Coalition, that had once spoken with certainty of victory, now whispered in corridors of surrender. Whole sectors burned while generals argued about who to blame and who would pay the cost. The soldiers on the front lines knew better than any politician that they were fighting a battle that could not be won, and each new report of destroyed ships and fallen fortresses only drove the knife deeper into their hearts. The enemy seemed endless, wave after wave of disciplined forces sweeping across defenses. With brutal precision, their technology was not superior, but their numbers and their merciless will made them unstoppable. Morale was collapsing as commanders told their exhausted troops to hold impossible lines and watch comrades fall beside them. In the camps, there was silence where once there had been laughter and songs. Now soldiers stared at the ground waiting for the end to come. They whispered that the war was already lost. Among the high command of the coalition, fear and despair grew thicker with each passing day. Strategies that had once been discussed with confidence now sounded hollow and desperate. The generals fought not just the enemy but also each other, vying to protect their own species from annihilation, even at the cost of the alliance. What had been a proud stand for survival had become a crumbling wall ready to fall at the first touch. Yet in the shadows, rumors began to move. Rumors of a species long dismissed as legend and myth. They were called humans, but most of the galaxy believed they had perished or were never real at all. They were spoken of as savages, dangerous and untamed, deathworlders who thrived in chaos and destruction and who carried war in their blood. The very idea of them unsettled the elder races who considered themselves refined and advanced. For many, the stories were warnings told to frighten young cadets about what true monsters looked like. Few ever thought such creatures might actually exist. Still, the coalition was desperate enough to listen. A fragment of intercepted communication spoke of human mercenaries fighting on distant worlds hidden away from the Council's gaze. Some swore they had seen them in ancient wars, vanishing as quickly as they appeared, leaving ruin. Behind others dismissed such stories as battlefield hallucinations born of desperation. But when a battered scout ship limped back with recordings of warriors unlike any they had ever seen, the Council could no longer deny it. The figures in the recording were human, and they fought with a ferocity that shocked even seasoned commanders. They did not fight like the disciplined lines of the coalition, nor the endless tides of the enemy. Instead, they fought with something wild, a storm of instinct and cunning that broke larger forces apart piece by piece. Their eyes burned with fire. Their shouts carried not only command but challenge. They were not soldiers by the definitions of the Council. They were predators in human form. As the video played, in the war chamber silence spread. The oldest of the counselors muttered about unleashing monsters into an already broken galaxy. Others whispered that perhaps monsters were exactly what they needed. The debate that followed raged through the night. Some argued that humanity, if it truly still lived, could not be trusted, for they would not bow to any alliance. Others claimed that to ignore them would be to condemn the galaxy to certain death. The enemy was advancing, and no strategy had stopped them so far. If the savages could do what no one else could, then they had to be brought into the fight. Meanwhile, on the ruined front lines, soldiers heard their commanders speak of reinforcements from a forgotten race. The words spread like wildfire, from trench to trench, and though many dismissed it as foolish hope, there was something in those whispers that lifted heads again. The idea that someone might still exist who could face the unstoppable enemy stirred something buried deep inside the beaten soldiers. The thought that there might be warriors fierce enough to turn the tide gave them the strength to rise again even before a single human appeared. They did not yet know if the rumors were truth or lies, but hope, once lost, had returned in small sparks across the darkness, and those sparks were waiting for a storm to ignite them. The Coalition Council gathered in the grand chamber that overlooked the shattered fleets drifting outside their core world. The holographic map of the galaxy glowed with red markings that showed enemy advances, while the blue lights of their defenses grew fewer every day. Every commander present understood that they were staring at the end of everything. Yet the air in the chamber was filled. With argument and denial, they spoke of failed strategies, of broken treaties, and of desperate measures, none of which offered real salvation. Then the battered scout ship was brought forward, its crew pale and trembling from the horrors they had seen. They carried with them the recordings of the strange warriors who had fought with a savage power, unlike anything the Coalition had ever encountered. The chamber fell into silence when the figures appeared on the screen, armored, but not with the sleek designs of the elder races. Their weapons looked brutal and primitive compared to Coalition standards, yet the efficiency of their use silenced any mockery. The humans fought not with lines or formations, but with instinct, with a fluidity that adapted to every move of the enemy. One moment they struck like shadows, the next like thunder, and their enemies fell apart under the chaos they unleashed. The counselors leaned closer, studying the footage with growing unease. Their bodies moved. Too quickly, their endurance seemed inhuman, and their willingness to fight to the last breath shook those who watched. Even when wounded, they pressed forward with reckless determination, their eyes alive with fire. The elder races who had lived for centuries recoiled at such reckless abandon, for they valued caution and order. Yet the younger officers in the chamber felt their hearts stir with something they had not felt in years. They saw in those savage warriors a chance, a glimmer of victory, where there had been only despair. The arguments began again, this time louder and more urgent. Some cried out that humanity was too dangerous to be unleashed, for if they were truly Deathworlders, then they might become a threat greater than the enemy. Others countered that no threat could be greater than the one already at their gates, and if humans could hold back that tide, even for a moment, then they must be called upon. Finally, after hours of bitter debate, the decision was made. The Council would seek out these humans no matter the risk. A delegation of warships would be sent to the coordinates the scout had recovered, and they would attempt to establish contact. It was not a choice made with trust, but with desperation, for the Coalition had no other options left. The soldiers on the front were already whispering of human savages, and those whispers had grown into fragile hope. To crush that hope without even trying would be to let the war collapse entirely. So the fleet departed, carrying ambassadors and warriors alike into the unknown. The crews spoke little on the journey, but in the silence of their minds they imagined what kind of people these humans were. Some envisioned beasts clothed in armor. Others imagined cunning predators who walked like men. All agreed that if they were real, then the galaxy would never be the same again. When the fleet finally emerged from warp, they found themselves above a scarred world, its surface marked by endless craters and burning wreckage. The sensors picked up faint signals scattered across the planet, and among them were strange transmissions encoded in ways none of the Coalition could decipher. Then the humans revealed themselves without ceremony. A formation of ships rose from the planet's atmosphere. Their designs crude by galactic standards, yet their presence sent a ripple of fear and awe through the Coalition crews. The human vessels were dark and scarred, their hulls marked with symbols of war. Their weapon systems bristling like teeth. The Coalition commanders sent out greetings carefully worded and filled with respect, knowing that even a wrong phrase might spark disaster. The humans did not answer at first, their ships circling like predators testing the new arrivals. When the reply finally came, it was not a polished message, but a blunt statement. You want our help? Prove you are worth saving. The words chilled the Coalition delegation, yet at the same time something about the raw honesty of the message struck them. These were not diplomats or politicians. They were warriors who had no patience for games. The Council envoy spoke again, humbling themselves, admitting the truth that the war was lost, and that without aid, there would be no tomorrow. For long minutes, silence followed as the human ships lingered in formation. Finally, a single ship broke away and docked with the Coalition flagship. From its airlock stepped human soldiers clad in heavy armor, their faces scarred, their eyes sharp, with the weight of countless battles. The Coalition officers froze in awe and fear as they realized the rumors had been true. The savages had returned, and now the fate of the war rested in their hands. The humans who stepped onto the Coalition flagship carried with them a presence that could not be ignored. Their armor was heavy and battered, yet clearly functional. every scratch and burn mark telling a story of survival. Their faces showed lines of hardship and struggle, and their eyes carried an intensity that unsettled the most seasoned of the alien officers. They did not stand in perfect formation like coalition soldiers. Instead, they walked with a quiet confidence that radiated strength as if no enemy could make them flinch. The leader of the squad, a tall man with scars running across his jaw, surveyed the chamber and spoke in a voice that rumbled with command. "We came because you called, but know this: we do not fight for free, and we do not fight for pride. We fight to win. If you want our help, then you will fight as we do, and you will not hesitate when the cost grows heavy." The coalition delegation exchanged nervous glances. Some among them had expected negotiations filled with ceremony, but the humans wasted no time. The envoy tried to explain the situation: the countless worlds already lost, the fleets destroyed, the soldiers demoralized. Yet the human leader cut him short with a simple question: "What are you willing to sacrifice to survive?" No one in the chamber answered at once, for they were not used to speaking of sacrifice. They were used to calculating risks and debating treaties, but not to bartering lives in such blunt terms. The silence that followed was heavy until one young officer spoke through clenched teeth. "Everything, if that is what it takes." The human leader studied him for a long moment, then nodded, perhaps satisfied. The following days were filled with uneasy exchanges. The coalition sought to understand how these savage soldiers fought, and the humans sought to gauge whether the coalition could be molded into something worth saving. Human warships patrolled alongside sleek alien vessels, and the differences between them could not have been sharper. Coalition crews valued order, discipline, and efficiency. Human crews embraced chaos, improvisation, and sheer stubbornness. What shocked the aliens most was how humans treated battle not as a duty, but as a hunt. They adapted to every scenario with frightening ease, and when presented with tactics, they responded with questions that broke down assumptions the coalition had never dared to challenge. When the humans demanded to see the front lines, the council hesitated, fearing to lose their fragile alliance if the humans judged them as weak. But the humans insisted they would not commit to a war without seeing it with their own eyes. And so a fleet was assembled and driven to the bleeding edges of coalition territory. The journey was tense. Every coalition soldier watching the humans with a mix of awe and fear. Some whispered that they were demons, others muttered that they were saviors. No one truly knew what they would bring. The front line was worse than even. The recordings had shown whole sectors were engulfed in smoke and fire. Planets burned as the enemy pressed its advantage, and the coalition lines held only by desperation and attrition. When the human ships entered the battle zone, they did not wait for instructions. They accelerated into the thick of combat, their weapons blazing with brutal efficiency. Coalition commanders screamed at them to maintain formation, but the humans ignored such calls. Their ships darted and weaved through enemy lines, tearing apart targets with ferocious precision. The coalition fleets, which had grown used to slow and grinding defenses, stared in disbelief as the humans carved through the enemy like predators among prey. On the ground, the shock was even. Greater human soldiers landed beside weary coalition troops who had already resigned themselves to defeat. The enemy advanced in tight, disciplined formations, and the coalition braced for collapse. But then the humans charged. Their war cries echoed across the battlefield, raw and terrifying. They fought with a reckless ferocity that made no sense to the ordered minds of the elder races. Every wound they took only seemed to drive them harder forward, and their tactics, though unpredictable, left the enemy confused and broken. Coalition soldiers who had long forgotten courage found themselves rising to join the charge, swept up by the storm that the humans unleashed. For the first time in years, the enemy fell back, not because of superior numbers or technology, but because they were confronted by something they could not predict and could not control. As the battle raged, the coalition commanders watched from their high vantage points. Their voices trembled as they realized what they were seeing. The rumors were true. Humans were not myths. They were not ghosts whispered of in old war stories. They were alive. They were savage. And they were terrifying. And for the first time in a long time, the coalition dared to believe that the war might not yet be lost. The aftermath of the first joint battle left the coalition reeling with disbelief and awe. For years they had fought with strategies polished by centuries of tradition, and every attempt had ended the same way in slow defeat and heavy losses. But the humans had entered the battlefield like a storm, and reshaped the fight in ways the coalition could not have imagined. When the smoke cleared and the wounded were carried from the field, coalition soldiers spoke in hushed tones of the savage allies who had come from nowhere to turn the tide. They looked at the humans not with the pity often reserved for desperate mercenaries, but with a dawning respect that bordered on fear. The humans did not celebrate their victory. They stood silent over the fallen both friend and foe, their faces marked by the same grim resolve that had carried them through countless unseen wars. The coalition high command demanded answers. They gathered reports from surviving officers and demanded explanations for how the humans had achieved what no one else had. Even as the council debated, the humans remained distant, refusing to be drawn into politics. They spent their days tending to their weapons, repairing armor, and drilling, their warriors. Their methods were brutal by coalition standards. Their training pushed soldiers past breaking points. Their commanders shouted not about honor or duty, but about survival and willpower. Coalition observers were horrified by the punishments and the ferocity of the drills, yet they could not deny the results. Human soldiers emerged from the regimen sharper, faster, and harder than before. The message was clear. Humanity thrived in hardship, and they intended to drag the coalition through the same fire if the war was to be won. On the front lines, the effect of the humans spread quickly. Coalition troops who had been beaten down by years of failure began to change in subtle ways. They moved with more confidence when they saw humans. At their side, they no longer dropped their weapons at the first sign of overwhelming numbers. Instead, they held the line because they believed the savages could turn the impossible into victory. Rumors of their deeds spread faster than official reports. Soldiers told tales of humans who fought through injuries that would kill others, who laughed in the face of death, and who charged into enemy lines with nothing but knives when their ammunition ran dry. To some, these stories were terrifying. To others, they were inspiring. The most important change was that hope was no longer a fragile whisper, but a roaring fire carried in the hearts of those who had nearly surrendered to despair. The enemy noticed the change as well. Their relentless formations that had crushed every resistance began to falter when facing human unpredictability. Commanders who had once been certain of victory found themselves struggling to counter tactics that made no sense by traditional standards. Humans struck at weak points ignored by coalition strategists. They used the terrain with cunning that seemed instinctive. They turned every ambush into a counterattack and every defeat into a lesson learned. The enemy, who had thrived on overwhelming force, was suddenly forced to adapt against an enemy that refused to die quietly and refused to retreat willingly. The coalition began to notice cracks in the once unstoppable tide, but with change came fear among the leaders of the coalition. Some counselors whispered that they had unleashed a force they could not control. They spoke of the humans as weapons, not allies. They feared that once the war was over, the savages would turn on them and carve their own empire from the ashes of victory. Others countered that without the humans there would be no future left to fear. The debates grew heated and distrust began to seep into the fragile alliance. The humans, for their part, paid little attention to such arguments. They made it clear, in every interaction, that their loyalty was not to politics but to the battle itself. They did not fight for glory or power. They fought because they refused to bow to extinction. One night after a particularly brutal clash, a young coalition soldier approached. A human campfire. The humans sat in silence, sharpening blades and cleaning rifles. Their leader noticed the youth and gestured for him to speak. The soldier confessed his fear that once the humans left, the war would be lost again. The human looked at him with eyes that carried the weight of centuries of struggle and spoke with quiet certainty. "We fight because we must not, because we are asked. If you learn to do the same, then even without us you will endure." Those words spread as quickly as the stories of their battles, and they carried a lesson deeper than tactics or weapons. The humans were not savages because they loved violence. They were savages because they understood survival, demanded a price that others had long forgotten to pay as the coalition prepared for the next campaign. The humans stood ready not as myths or mercenaries, but as a storm that had chosen to fight beside them. And though fear lingered among the leaders on the ground among the soldiers, hope had become something far stronger than rumor. It had become belief. The fifth campaign began on a battlefield unlike any other before it. The coalition had chosen to strike at a contested system where the enemy had built a forward fortress that seemed impenetrable for years. Every attempt to breach it had failed, with fleets shattered against its defenses and armies ground into dust at its gates. The High Council had never dared to risk another assault until the humans demanded it. They claimed that to defeat the enemy they must strike not where it was weak, but where it believed itself untouchable. The plan sounded like madness to coalition strategists who valued caution and measured force, but the humans dismissed hesitation with cold certainty. They argued that the enemy had grown arrogant and that arrogance was the weapon that could be used against them. The fleet gathered at the edge of the system ships from a dozen species, hovering in uneasy formation. The human vessels looked crude beside the elegant lines of coalition warships, but when the signal was given they plunged forward with a ferocity that startled even their allies. The coalition followed, caught between fear and admiration as the human strategy unfolded. Instead of a steady, coordinated advance, the humans broke into smaller groups, weaving through enemy fire and striking at vulnerable points. They ignored standard formations and turned the battle into chaos. The enemy, who had expected predictable tactics, faltered as their ordered defenses struggled to counter the storm. For the first time in living memory, the fortress shields flickered and failed under the relentless assault. On the ground, the war was even more brutal. Human soldiers led the charge against enemy lines, tearing through barricades with explosives and sheer determination. Coalition troops followed, uncertain at first, but soon swept up in the momentum. Entire battalions, who once trembled at the thought of facing the enemy, now roared into battle with courage borrowed from their savage allies. The fighting was close and bloody. The enemy had dug deep into the fortress with traps and strongholds at every turn, yet the humans thrived in the chaos. They fought in tunnels with knives and bare hands. They turned captured weapons against their foes. They did not simply win ground, they made the ground theirs with every step. The coalition commanders watching through battlefield feeds could scarcely believe their eyes. The fortress that had stood for decades was beginning to fall. Among the humans there was no celebration, only grim determination. They moved from one firestorm to the next, as though driven by an inner fire that never dimmed. Coalition officers tried to question their methods, but the humans offered little explanation. They simply said that wars are not won by playing safe, wars are won by outlasting those who would see you broken. One alien captain remarked that humans fought as though every battle was personal, and the human commander replied that for them, it always was. They remembered every fallen comrade, every scar, every betrayal, and they carried that memory into each fight like a weapon sharper than any blade. As the days of battle dragged on, the coalition began to see transformation in their own soldiers. No longer were they passive defenders waiting to be slaughtered. They began to fight with the same reckless energy, charging forward when once they would have retreated. Even the oldest and most cautious of commanders admitted that something had changed. The humans had not only broken the fortress, they had broken the despair that had bound the coalition for so long. The victory was costly, lives lost beyond count and ships reduced to wreckage. Yet when the fortress finally collapsed and its towers burned, the cheers that echoed across the galaxy were louder than the cries of mourning. For the first time, the coalition had struck a blow that the enemy could not hide, and the myth of invincibility was shattered. But with victory came a new kind of unease. The counselors who feared the humans saw their worst suspicions confirmed. They argued that without human savagery, such reckless attacks would never have succeeded, and they warned that the coalition was becoming dependent on them. Already whispers spread that humanity was more terrifying than the enemy itself. The way they fought, the way they endured it, was unnatural by the standards of the civilized races. Some began to ask what price they would demand when the war was finally over. Others even suggested plans to one day remove them before they became too powerful. Yet on the front lines, none of that mattered. To the soldiers who had bled beside them, the humans were no longer outsiders. They were brothers and sisters in arms, Savages, perhaps, but savages who had taught them how to survive when the fortress fell and the smoke cleared. The humans did not claim the glory. They walked among the wounded, carrying the injured to safety, tending to the fallen, and speaking words of iron that rekindled strength in broken hearts. They reminded everyone that victory was not the end, it was only the beginning, for the enemy would come again and harder than before. They told the soldiers to rest but not to grow comfortable, because survival was never certain, and tomorrow would demand even more than today. The coalition began to understand that fighting alongside humans meant accepting not just their strength but their philosophy. War was not about honor or pride. It was about enduring the unbearable and finding victory in the ashes of ruin. And though fear lingered in the halls of power on the battlefield, belief in the humans grew unshakable. The fall of the fortress sent shockwaves through the galaxy, and for the first time, the enemy realized that their dominance was not absolute. They had lost strongholds before, but never to such audacity, never to an assault that ignored every rule of war. They had grown used to exploiting coalition leaders announce the victory as proof of renewed strength. But all knew it was the humans who had carried the day, the soldiers on. The front spoke their names with reverence, while the council whispered their names with dread. What unsettled the leaders most was that the humans did not behave like conquerors. They did not demand tribute or boast of their deeds. Instead, they prepared for the next battle as though the victory had been nothing more than another step on an endless road. Their commander warned the coalition plainly. Do not think the enemy beaten. They will come back harder, and if you are not ready, they will break you again. The prediction proved true. Within weeks, enemy fleets surged across the border with greater ferocity than before. Entire sectors were set ablaze as they tried to erase the humiliation of their defeat. The coalition, who once would have faltered under such pressure, now had something they had lacked before: an example to follow. The humans were always at the front, always where the fighting was thickest. They did not retreat. They did not hesitate. They fought until the ground itself seemed to tremble beneath them, and when coalition soldiers saw this, they no longer cowered. They stood their ground because the humans had shown them that survival was possible. Still, the war took its toll. The enemy adapted quickly, and their numbers continued to overwhelm. The coalition began to lean more heavily on the humans, who seemed to carry the weight of entire armies upon their shoulders. In every major engagement, the humans were called first, and they never refused. Yet the more victories they brought, the deeper the unease among the counselors. Some warned that humanity was becoming indispensable, that without them, the coalition would crumble. Others argued that it was already too late. The humans had changed the nature of the war, and nothing could undo that. Among the soldiers, however, there was no fear of betrayal. There was only loyalty forged in fire. An alien sergeant who had once despised the idea of fighting beside so-called savages found himself dragging a wounded human to safety during one battle. The human, though bleeding and barely able to stand, insisted on covering the retreat with a grin that spoke of defiance against death itself. When asked later why they fought so recklessly, the human answered, "Because if I fall, another will rise. That is who we are." The sergeant carried those words into every battle thereafter, and he was not alone. Many coalition troops began to adopt human habits, shouting war cries, charging without hesitation, and refusing to surrender. Their commanders disapproved but could not deny that results followed. Wherever the humans had left their mark, tensions within the council grew darker. Every triumph on the battlefield only deepened their fear of the alliance they had forged. They could not ignore the humans, but they could not control them either. A faction began to quietly plot ways to limit their influence. Whispered discussions of sabotage and betrayal crept into closed meetings. Some suggested sending the humans into unwinnable battles to bleed them out. Others whispered of secret weapons that might one day be turned against them. But for all their schemes, none dared act openly, for the people of the coalition now believed in the humans too strongly. To betray them openly would ignite rebellion among their own ranks. The humans seemed to sense the distrust, but they paid it little mind. Their commander gathered the allied generals and laid out a vision of total war. He spoke not of cautious defenses, but of striking deep into the enemy's heart, of tearing down the very power that drove their endless armies. The coalition generals balked at such audacity, but the humans insisted that anything less would only prolong the suffering. "We do not fight to survive another day, we fight to end this war." Those were his words, and they carried a weight that silenced the chamber. As preparations for the next campaign began, the coalition soldiers whispered that this would be the decisive strike. The humans would lead them not merely to hold the line, but to break it entirely. The council fretted over the risks and plotted their quiet schemes, but the armies were already in motion. Across the stars, ships gathered, weapons were forged, and men and women of countless species prepared for the most dangerous fight of their lives. And at the heart of it all, the humans stood ready, grim and resolute. Their scars bore witness to the truth they already knew. Wars were not won by fear. Wars were won by those willing to walk through fire and keep walking no matter the cost. The galaxy did not yet know whether it could endure such a storm, but it would soon find out. The final campaign began under skies, painted with the fires of countless worlds and the rumble of warships as they sliced through the void. The coalition forces assembled behind the humans, whose presence alone seemed to steady nerves and harden hearts. Every species that had ever doubted them now looked to them for guidance, for courage, for the certainty that victory was still possible. The humans moved among their ranks with a calm that belied the storm about to be unleashed. Their eyes scanned the horizon, calculating strategy, reading terrain, predicting enemy movement without hesitation. Every soldier who saw them knew instinctively that this was no ordinary leadership. This was something older, something primal, something that had been forged in the crucible of hardship and survival. The humans did not speak of fear, they spoke of action, and their words carried more weight than any decree or command. As the first strike launched, it became clear why the humans were feared across the galaxy. The enemy had amassed a fleet meant to crush the coalition in one decisive blow, but the humans anticipated every move. They guided the coalition forces through traps and ambushes, and when the moment came, they struck with precision and brutality. The enemy's formation shattered under the relentless advance of human soldiers who did not pause to count casualties or calculate risk. Their strategy was simple but devastating. Hit. Fast, hit hard, and never give the opponent a moment to recover. Every coalition ship followed their lead, knowing that hesitation would mean annihilation. On the surface of the first world under siege, humans led boarding parties that tore through fortresses and outposts with a ferocity that made legends tremble. Soldiers who had once believed the planet lost watched in awe as humans overcame impossible odds, moving as a single unstoppable force. Their weapons never faltered, their tactics never failed, and their morale was contagious. The coalition armies found new reserves of strength in themselves because they had witnessed humans do what no other species could accomplish. They did not just fight. They inspired, and hope spread like wildfire through ranks that had been on the brink of despair. Yet the war was far from over. Even as humans and their allies gained ground, the enemy adapted, deploying monstrous machines and ruthless tactics designed to crush resistance. The humans met each challenge not with hesitation, but with innovation. Each obstacle was met with improvisation and courage. They turned the enemy's strength against them, turning traps into traps of their own making and drawing victories from situations that seemed impossible. In every battle, the humans taught the coalition not merely how to fight, but how to survive, how to endure, how to prevail when every instinct screamed surrender. As the final assault loomed, the coalition forces assembled on the last bastion of the enemy's power. The humans took their place at the vanguard, their eyes scanning the horizon for weakness. Their leader raised his hand, and a silence fell over all the armies across hundreds of worlds. They waited not for orders, but for the signal that the humans would give. And when it came, a roar of unity rose from ships and soldiers alike as they surged forward. The enemy met them with all their might, but they were already too late. The humans had set the pace and the rhythm of battle, and all who followed could not falter. The clash was titanic. Worlds shook with the intensity of fire and steel, and yet humans pressed on undeterred. They moved through chaos with a clarity that was almost frightening, each strike precise, each decision deliberate and unyielding. Around them, coalition soldiers found courage that they did not know they possessed. They followed without question through smoke and flame because the humans had shown them the path. The enemy began to crumble, not because they were weak, but because they were confronted with something. They could not understand the savage brilliance of humanity unleashed without restraint. When the dust settled, the war was over. The enemy had been broken, their command shattered and their legions scattered. Across the galaxy, the message was clear. Humanity had arrived not as conquerors but as liberators, as warriors whose strength lay not just in arms, but in courage, determination, and the refusal to yield. When coalition soldiers looked upon the humans, they saw the embodiment of hope and the reminder that no matter how dire the circumstances, there were those who would rise and face the storm. The council gathered on the bridge of the flagship, the humans at their center. They did not seek glory for themselves. They only sought to ensure that peace could be maintained and that those who had survived would have a chance to rebuild the galaxy, had witnessed the rise of something extraordinary, and those who doubted humanity before now understood that to underestimate them was a mistake no species would repeat. The humans had shown that survival was only the beginning, that true strength came from will, from unity, from the refusal to surrender even in the face of annihilation. As celebrations began across liberated worlds, the humans did not rest. They prepared for what might come next, knowing that the galaxy was vast and threats would always emerge. But for now, the war was over, and the legends of savage human soldiers who could change the tide of battle were born. These stories would echo through generations, inspiring those who would one day follow in their footsteps and ensuring that humanity would never again be forgotten. The galaxy was quiet now after the storms of war had passed and the fires of battle had dimmed, but in the hearts of every being who had witnessed the humans there was a pulse of awe, a spark of fear and an unshakable respect. The humans did not parade through the stars seeking power or dominion. They moved like shadows of inevitability, appearing wherever hope seemed lost and turning despair into action. They walked among the coalition forces, and even the enemy, who remained scattered and broken, could not help but tremble at their presence. Each human carried with them an aura of something ancient, something primal, a reminder that survival was more than instinct. It was determination, courage, and the refusal to bow to impossibility. Worlds that had once been on the brink of annihilation now flourished under the vigilance and guidance of the humans who did not impose their will, but inspired others to find strength within themselves. Entire fleets rebuilt from the ruins bore the mark of human ingenuity and leadership. Even the alien races that had mocked them before could not deny the change that had swept across the galaxy. The humans had redefined war and survival. They had become the axis around which hope turned and the standard by which courage was measured. Amidst the celebrations and rebuilding, humans continued their silent patrols, their eyes always scanning the horizon for the faintest sign of danger. Every encounter was met with efficiency and precision, but also with a presence that reminded all who faced them that humanity was not to be underestimated. They taught allies the value of resilience, of thinking beyond fear, and embracing the impossible as a challenge to be overcome. Not every species could match their strength or endure their tactics, but every species could learn from their will, from their unyielding spirit that refused to accept defeat as a permanent condition. Legends spread across planets and star systems about the humans who arrived when the war was lost and turned the tide without hesitation, without compromise. Each story carried the same truth, that humans were savage only to those who threatened life and peace, and merciless only to the forces of destruction. The galaxy learned to respect their unpredictability, their adaptability, and their singular focus on survival and victory. Humans had proven that strength was not measured merely in numbers or technology, but in the unbreakable resolve to rise and fight when all seemed hopeless. In the quiet moments between battles, humans trained, shared knowledge, and fostered unity across the coalition. They were leaders without claiming the title. They were warriors without seeking glory, and their mere presence instilled confidence in those who had doubted themselves. Their legend was not built on conquest alone, but on the promise that wherever humans walked, the impossible could become possible, and despair could be turned into triumph. Each ship that carried humans to distant systems carried hope, and a warning that humanity could never be ignored. As the stars glittered above the rebuilt worlds, the humans looked outward and forward, knowing the galaxy was vast and full of threats, but they faced it with the same resolve that had brought them through countless wars, with every strike precise, with every strategy flawless, and every decision guided by an instinct honed over generations. The war had been won not just by weapons or numbers, but by the presence of humanity and the refusal to accept failure as an option. The stories of the savage human soldiers would be told for centuries, reminding all that when humans arrived, there was always a chance to turn the tide. The galaxy had changed forever. It had seen what it meant when humans fought not for glory, not for conquest, but for survival and the protection of life and freedom. The other species had learned the cost of underestimating humanity and the value of courage inspired by those who would not surrender. They had seen the impossible made real, and the hopeless made victorious. Humans became the measure of endurance, the standard of courage, and the living proof that even when all seemed lost, the right beings could make a difference. The end.